So if you have a case of the Mondays, does it carry over to the next day? Can it be a case of the Tuesdays as well? I mean, the browser window is working, so we don't have a case of the Tuesdays there, or that case of the Mondays ended there. So at least good job by you. Appreciate you working today up in the corner of the screen. But obviously, the news didn't exactly get better yesterday in the aftermath of all the talk about missing out on the WPIAL and not getting WPIAL recruits after another guy committed to Penn State on Sunday. Some news came out of a different sort yesterday with Charlie Partridge leaving the Pitt coaching staff to go to the NFL, the Indianapolis Colts. And it's a blow to Pitt on a lot of levels. And I think there's a lot of different things we could talk about here with the departure of Charlie Partridge. So that's what we're going to do today. We're going to talk about Charlie Partridge leaving Pitt, what it means for the Panthers, what it means for recruiting, what it means for the team, what it means for college football. Yeah, we're going to cover a lot of ground on the Morning Pitt right here on youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. It's Tuesday. It's the Morning Pitt. It's youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. We now commence the advertising and plugs. People always point out like, oh man, you just advertise so much. Why do you plug so much? Well, listen, man. All right. Like close to 50% of the people who watch these videos are not subscribed to our YouTube channel. So you ask me, why do I always talk about, the plugs, plugging the YouTube channel, plugging the website? It's because you guys watching aren't subscribed to our YouTube channel, youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. Listen, if everybody who watched this video right now clicked the subscribe button, you know what would happen? We'd get 100% subscribers watching the videos, and then I wouldn't have to plug it every time. But you guys aren't doing your part of it. I'm doing my job. You know, I'm holding up my part of the deal and putting these videos out every day. You can do your part and like this video and subscribe, youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. It's where we put all our Pitt video content. These daily Morning Pitt videos, our weekly live stream that we do every Wednesday night at 8 o'clock. This week, it'll be a post-game show after the NC State game. We'll go live when that game ends tomorrow night and talk about the game and get your comments and questions. Those post-game shows are always fun to do. Look forward to that one tomorrow night. And so we have the weekly live streams. We do post-game shows after every road game. And we have these Morning Pitt videos in addition to press conferences and post-games and all that kind of stuff. It's all right here at youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. So like this video and subscribe, and then you won't miss out on anything. And of course, the website, which I also have to plug since it's, like my job and, feeds my family, Panther-Lair.com, Pittsburgh.rivals.com. It's kind of the reason we do these videos. It's actually not just for your entertainment. It's to promote the website. That's the reason we're here, in case there was any uncertainty about that. But it is the most comprehensive source of Pitt sports news on the internet, football, basketball, and recruiting. You find it all at Panther-Lair.com and message boards to interact with hundreds and thousands of other Pitt fans all day, every day. Panther-Lair.com, Pittsburgh.rivals.com. So Charlie Partridge leaving Pitt, going to the NFL. And there's a lot of angles to this thing. I mean, there's a lot of pieces to sort of, kind of put together, or different, I think, threads you could follow. Whether it's related to Pitt recruiting, whether it's related to Pitt's roster, the impact Charlie Partridge has had, what it means for Pat Narduzzi and his coaching staff makeup, all the way up to what it means for college football, and sort of the general state of things, which has been a pretty common conversation topic lately. After, you have Nick Saban retiring, you have Jeff Hafley going, Jim Harbaugh leaves to go to the NFL. Jeff Hafley leaves Boston College to go to the NFL. And Hafley being the most recent move, he left Boston College to go be the Green Bay Packers defensive coordinator. Definitely drew a lot of, I can't say outrage, but outcry from college football media, college sports media. See, coaches are just running away from college football in droves. This is a guy who left a head coaching job to be a coordinator. And I appreciate Mike DeCourcy from the Sporting News, who had a column on that yesterday, basically saying, like, look, you're talking about, Saban is a multimillionaire in his 70s who retired. It's not that weird of a thing. Harbaugh left Michigan to be a head coach in the NFL. Hafley left to be a defensive coordinator in the NFL, but you know how it goes in the NFL. If you are relatively young, like Jeff is, and you can have success for a couple of years as a coordinator in the NFL, that gives you an opportunity to be a head coach in the NFL. And so, I don't necessarily view it as a step down to go from being the head coach at Boston College to being the defensive coordinator for the Packers. It's not like Hafley was just running away from college football. That's not to say he doesn't and didn't have his frustrations with the sport. I'm sure he probably did, and I'm sure a lot of guys do. But I don't know if it was necessarily the doom, the end of college football as we know it, because Jeff Hafley left Boston College after 4 years when he was like 5 games under 500 or whatever his record ended up being. Now, that being said, maybe all of the outcry is not necessary. Not all of the Chicken Little sky is falling is necessary, but there is something to it. And I think with Charlie Partridge, and probably a lot of guys, the NFL looks pretty appealing right now. Now, make no mistake about it. The NFL has always looked appealing. The NFL is still the top of the food chain. And if you're a coach looking to make it at the highest level and prove it at the highest level and achieve at the highest level, that's where you're trying to get. I think there are guys who are happy to be college coaches. There are guys who are certainly better suited to be college coaches. But almost all of them want a shot in the NFL. And you can see that where some of the most successful college coaches end up taking that shot in the NFL. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. But they all take that shot, or most of them who get the opportunity to do so, take that shot. Because that's the highest level. And that's where you want to achieve. You're a competitor. You're trying to prove yourself, like I say, at the highest level of football. But even beyond that, the NFL being a more appealing situation than college is not necessarily new, and it's not necessarily or exclusively related to NIL and the transfer portal. And I think the first thing, the thing I always point out is just the schedule, quality of life. Understand what a college football coach's year looks like, all right? So let's just start on August 1st, where you have training camp, and you're working 10-hour days, probably, if not longer, basically all of August. And then that finally ends, and then you're into the season, where guess what? You're working 12-hour days again, in addition to having game day, all through the fall. You don't get any time off, because that week when you have an off week, you know what you're doing? You're going out on the road recruiting. You have no time off. You have no nights at home. I mean, you sleep at home, but you have very few hours. You are spending far more hours out of the house and at the office day after day after day, 7 days a week. And the season finally ends, so you get some rest then. Nope. You go right out on the road recruiting, and this time you're spending weeks on the road recruiting. You might come home on the weekend where you get to sleep in your own bed. The recruiting period finally ends around mid-December, so you get a couple of weeks at home, and then in January you're right back on the road until the first week of February. Right now you get a few weeks where you'll have just sort of regular work days where you go into the office, and then you're into spring camp. And as soon as spring camp ends, you know what you're doing? You're back out on the road for weeks at a time. And some guys are able to come home on the weekends depending on where they are. Some guys, and I think Charlie Partridge is one, would spend 2 weeks in Florida. And do that for over the course of 6 weeks, from mid-April until the end of May. And then May ends, okay, you're back on campus, and now you're hosting recruiting visits and you're hosting prospect camps and all these things. July is a month where you actually have some downtime. But otherwise, you are working all the time, which is not unique. I mean, everybody has a job where they have to work all the time. But the travel, the on the road, the recruiting, never mind hanging on the whims of teenagers, which has been what college football recruiting has been forever. That's nothing new. But the time commitment, the time away from home, and just what the recruiting process is. Before we ever get to NIL and transfer portal, what the recruiting process is. It's a grind, and it's hard. And there are certainly challenges in the NFL where you're trying to coach guys who make more money than you. And I think that could bring some very interesting challenges. But you're not recruiting. You're not going into homes and trying to schmooze, and sell your program all the time to teenagers, who are prone to the whims of teenagers. They act like teenagers. And you're not sort of bound by that. And so I think the NFL has always held an appeal in that regard. Not that it's easier, but to some extent, it's easier. It's a different kind of job than college. And then you throw in the developments over the last 2 years, 3 years of NIL and the transfer portal, and particularly NIL as it relates to high school recruiting. I mean, we'll set aside the transfer portal for a second, but as it relates to high school recruiting, it has changed the game. I think it's had more of an impact on the transfer portal or working in conjunction with the transfer portal, but I think NIL has been a factor in high school recruiting. And so you end up with situations like Pitt had late in the stretch here. And there's always going to be some late cycle drama with recruiting, but where you're fighting to hold on to guys against forces that you may or may not even know exist, or may not even know how real they are. They had battles right up until signing day for a couple guys in this recruiting class that were different than the typical sort of run up to signing day recruiting battles that you're going to run into. And even you could go back to like June. Think about how many times this June Pat Narduzzi would send out his recruiting, his "we got a commitment" tweet. And then we would all wait. We would all wait for the recruit to announce. We would all wait for the recruit to make his commitment known. And we'd have sometimes, some rumors or things like that, but you just wait and wait. And there were times where you were waiting like weeks or months for the recruit to finally announce. And the coaching staff, they still believed that they had the commitment. But the longer it goes before that kid makes it public, it's not like making it public is binding in any way, but the longer the recruit goes without making it public, the more they're sort of nervous and waiting and kind of hanging on, again, the whims and mood swings of a teenager. And that could wear you down at a certain point. At a certain point, I don't think it's crazy to imagine that you sit back and you say, what am I doing here? Like, what am I doing? I want to coach football. And I don't even mind recruiting. I like the recruiting process. But what the hell are we doing here? When my livelihood and it's all my livelihood, if I'm a college coach, my livelihood has always been driven by and controlled by teenagers, and young people. And that's great. There's certain elements of that are great. But the way it has changed in the last 2 or 3 years, and the way those young people are being steered, and the way those teenagers are making their decisions and the things that are impacting them, is not the same as it was 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 5 years ago. And I could see for a veteran coach like Partridge, because I know there's going to be somebody in the comments who are like, oh, dude, shut up about this. Start talking about Charlie Partridge. Well, this is part of it. Okay? Because I could see how a veteran coach like Partridge could say, I don't want to deal with this anymore. I don't want to deal with this anymore. There are always recruiting battles. There's always negative recruiting, and you're going back and forth and trying to land a kid, and that's part of it. But what it has become now, with the influences that have moved in, and the impact of money as an influencing factor, pretty much above board. That's not what I signed up for. And I could see how a coach could say that. And I think that's what Charlie Partridge said. And I think that's why Charlie Partridge decided now was the time to move on. And we've all spent the last 7 years waiting for Charlie Partridge to get a job at Miami or Florida State or someplace like that. But it turns out that, I don't think that going to those places would have solved his issues, with the sport, or his concerns with the sport. Because he would still be right in the mix of it and might even be in a worse situation than he was here. So he goes to the NFL, where, as he said in his tweet, he can go coach football. So what does it mean for Pitt? I think there are a lot of factors. And I'm going to say one right off the top of the... Well, I'll save it for last, actually. There's one factor, and I mentioned this on the message board, but I think it's probably underrated and underspoken. But I'll get to that one last. We know of Charlie Partridge for two big things: his recruiting and his coaching, right? And those are, that's some of the biggest impact that his departure is going to have. I think Charlie Partridge, known as a great recruiter, he was, probably one of the two best recruiters on Pitt's staff for the past few years. I think Corey Sanders is pretty high on that list, and I think Partridge and Sanders kind of worked in tandem and should share credit for really one of Pitt's best local, recruiting hauls over the last. Over the Narduzzi era, really, with Deion Hayes in the 2020 recruiting class, and then that three-man group in 2021 of Elliott Donald, Nakai Johnson, and Dorian Ford. And whatever you want to say about what Donald and Ford and Johnson have become, or what they've done in their careers, and Hayes too, if you want to throw him in, those were big recruiting wins. Those were guys who were coveted by a lot of schools, including one in state who really wanted some or all of those recruits. And Pitt was able to win those recruiting battles, and it's a credit to Charlie Partridge and Corey Sanders. Partridge, of course, made his name as a recruiter in South Florida, the Miami area, and that's certainly where he produced a lot of recruits. I tried to write down everybody he was responsible for signing. From the 2018 recruiting class, which was the first class that he was a part of here at Pitt when he returned for his second stint. Of course, he coached here in the, I think, 2003 to 2007 or so. When he came back in 2017, he was part of the 2018, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, and 2024 recruiting classes. So that's 7 classes that Partridge had a hand in. And I tried to write down and keep track of all the guys that he was responsible for. Mostly guys out of Florida, although, I think you could even look at the 2018 recruiting class. You look at some of the guys Pitt got out of the Whippeal that year, Blake Sabovic and Jake Cradle. The 2 Thomas Jefferson guys, Noah Palmer and Devin Danielson, David Green from Central Catholic. And I think you would say that Partridge was the primary reason there. I mean, he was the primary recruiter for those guys and the primary reason that Pitt was able to land them. That year, he also got Marquez Williams. He was the primary recruiter for Williams and Shockey Jacques Louis, actually. The following year, some of the more notable ones that Partridge had something to do with: Kalijah Cansey, Vincent Davis, Daniel Carter, Nate Temple, who's back for another year at Pitt. 2020, not a lot of production, but some good signings here. Javante Royal and Aiden Henningham were good recruits to land. You also got Emmanuel Belgrave and Sam Williams. Both of those guys ended up transferring. 2021, he was the main recruiter for PJ O'Brien, which I don't think we typically associate Partridge with getting O'Brien, but he was the main recruiter there. I think in 2022 he was the main recruiter for Sean Fitzsimmons. Certainly he probably, I think, had something to do with Isaiah Neal coming in 2023, as well as Lamar Seymour and Jesse Anderson. And then this year he was the primary guy for Jeremiah Marcelin, the linebacker who went down to the wire. Sincere Edwards, a defensive end, 4-star guy. Alan Bryant, I think, the defensive back from Florida. I think Partridge obviously played a big role in getting Jasir Whittington and Francis Brew, the other top defensive tackle prospects in this class, in addition to the transfers. And it was only 2 weeks ago when David Ojebwe from Clemson and Nick James from Indiana and Nate Matlack from Kansas State were all talking about the reason they picked Pitt. One of the primary reasons was the opportunity to work with Charlie Partridge. And so I think you give Partridge credit for those guys as well. I think they have to go on his list. The best recruitments here, I mean, the guys that Partridge really won, I would say his biggest wins, I mean, I think Marcelin and Edwards in this class. Francis Brew, I think he gets some credit for holding on to Brew, who was one of those guys who went down to the wire with some other schools trying to push for him. Same thing with Marcelin, and Pitt ended up winning both of those recruiting battles. I think Lamar Seymour was a big get last year. I think Jesse Anderson, there was some late interest from other schools that Pitt was able to hold off in last year's class. I think Royal and Henningham in the 2020 class were big signings for Pitt, big scores for Pitt. In addition to, like I said, his work in the 2021 class locally with Donald Ford and Nakai Johnson. 2019, is probably the best recruit that he signed was Kalijah Cansey. And I'm talking about the best recruit that Charlie Partridge signed over his 7 years at Pitt. Largely because of what Cansey became. I think the evaluation, identifying somebody who fit Pitt's defense, somebody that he thought he could mold into a productive player, and obviously it worked out. You know what I mean? Partridge ended up, coaching Kalijah Cansey into, he was an All-American, ACC Defensive Player of the Year, and a first-round draft pick. Pretty strong work there from Charlie Partridge, and I would say Cansey probably stands as his crowning achievement, or the crowning achievement of Partridge's final 7 years, or last 7 years here. When you look at the players that he coached, I counted about 39 scholarship defensive linemen, included a couple walk-ons who came as walk-ons, but they went on scholarship. When you look at the top line guys, there were really 4 that stand out as the best players that Partridge coached here. Cansey, obviously, Jalen Twyman, another All-American defensive tackle, and then Rashad Weaver and Patrick Jones, a pair of All-American defensive ends. Weaver and Jones somehow were 2-star prospects on Rivals, a fact that I'm sure Partridge pointed out a lot, as well he should, as evidence of his coaching ability and his ability to develop talent. But those guys ended up being 2 of the best defensive players under Partridge and under Pat Narduzzi since Narduzzi arrived. I think those 4 stand out as really the stars of Partridge's 7 years here: Cansey, Twyman, Weaver, and Jones. And then you move on, you look at guys who really contributed a lot, played a lot. Deslin Alexander, I think, was a really solid player for Pitt. John Morgan, Haba Baldonado was really good. I think injuries are the only thing that keep him out of that group with Weaver, Jones, Twyman, and Cansey. I think Baldonado should have been in that group, but I think because he was hurt, it sort of limited his impact a little bit. DeAndre Jules ended up developing into something, had a pretty good final year at Pitt before he transferred to South Carolina. Deion Hayes is a nice player. Sam Okunlola was well on his way to being a star before he transferred to Colorado this past offseason. I mentioned John Morgan, the 3 defensive tackles, Devin Danielson, Tyler Bentley, and David Green. Again, like really solid players. Nate Temple, really solid players who Charlie Partridge coached, I think coached well and helped develop into good contributors for Pitt's defensive line over the years. I still remember when Partridge was first hired, Josh Conklin, who was the defensive coordinator at the time, said, everybody talks about Charlie Partridge being a great recruiter, but he's a great football coach. And I think that's true. I think Partridge had an eye for talent. I think he's a good developer of talent. I think he's a smart football coach. I think he knows the game and understands a crucial position of the defensive line. And he's got a first-round draft pick to show for it from his time at Pitt in Kalijah Cansey. The other thing, and the final thing I'll mention about what I think Pitt is losing with Charlie Partridge going, is the other part of his title at Pitt. He was a defensive line coach. We all know that. But he was also assistant head coach. And sometimes you see titles like that and you sort of assume, well, they got that title so they could get a raise. And there might have been some truth to that. I think Charlie Partridge got some raises over the years in order to keep him because he was a regular off-season target for other schools. But I do think Partridge had some roles within the assistant head coach. I think he had some duties and responsibilities within the assistant head coach title that he took seriously. I think Partridge was in the unique position of being a coach on this staff who could walk into Pat Narduzzi's office and give him a complete and honest assessment of a situation, whether or not it's what Narduzzi wanted to hear. And I'm not sure how many assistant coaches there are on this staff who would have the latitude to do that, or putting it very simply, the stones to do it. Because Pat Narduzzi, I think, is a lot of things. I think he is very demanding as a head coach. And I think if you are going to challenge him on something, you have to be ready. I think you've got to be well prepared to challenge him on something, because you're probably going to get taken to the mattresses. Or taken to the mat, I guess I should say. But I think Partridge was in a position where he has and has Pat Narduzzi's respect, and he could speak with Narduzzi openly and honestly about a situation with the team, whether it's on the field, off the field, in the coaches' meetings, whatever it is, whatever he felt like Pat Narduzzi needed to hear. Not necessarily what Narduzzi wanted to hear, but what Narduzzi needed to hear. I think Partridge could walk into his office and tell him and say it. And that doesn't mean that it wasn't going to make Narduzzi angry. It doesn't mean he wasn't going to get negative feedback, but he was in the unique position where I think he could do that. And I don't know if there's a coach on this staff right now in a similar position. And I don't claim to know all of the office dynamics at Pitt right now. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe everybody's got that, feels like they can do it. But I've never really gotten that sense that there are a lot of people Narduzzi will listen to, for better or for worse, just to put it as succinctly as possible. And that's probably not, is probably lacking some context. But I don't feel like there are a lot of people that he would listen to in that kind of setting. But I think Partridge was one. And I think Partridge was one who could do it and was comfortable doing it and confident enough in himself to do it. And now he's gone. And I don't know if anybody on the current staff steps up into that role. And I don't know. I mean, there are probably coaches Narduzzi could hire who would fill that role, but I don't know if he's going to or not. And will that translate into wins or losses or anything different with what we'll see from the program? I don't know. But I think it's good to have people who will challenge you. If you're the leader, if you're the executive, I think it's good to have people who will challenge you on things. And, I was going to say we'll see how that develops, but we won't. We won't see how that develops. I guess we'll see if we hear anything about how that develops. But, I think that's probably going to be an underrated element of Partridge's departure. So, on a personal level, it's disappointing to see him go. I've known Charlie since he was at Pitt the first time. I think he's a good person. I think he's a good football coach. And he was a good interview. On a professional level, that's part of it. He was a good interview, and I'll miss having him around. Wish him the best of luck, of course. And I can't say I don't understand why he went. Like I said at the beginning, that whole early, first 10 minutes of this thing, it's a different game now in college. And while I don't think the sky is falling as much as some people would have you believe over the weekend, I do think there will be a lot of coaches who, if they have the opportunity to go to the NFL, will go and get away from some of the headaches that have been created in college sports, or maybe just exacerbated in college sports over the last 3 years. So now we'll look and see who Pitt hires to be defensive line coach going forward. All right. That does it for our Tuesday edition of the Morning Pit. We'll be back tomorrow for more. We'll have some basketball talk tomorrow to get ready for the NC State game. And then, of course, we'll have the live Panther-Lair show, the live post-game show after the game tomorrow night. So make sure you subscribe to our YouTube channel. And that way you won't miss any of our Pitt video content. YouTube.com/Panther-Lair.com. Check out the website, Panther-Lair.com, Pittsburgh.rivals.com, to get all of the Pitt sports news that you can handle, and message boards to talk with other Pitt fans about how the sky is falling and the world is ending and the program should be shut down. It's good times. We have a lot of fun on the message board. So come and hang out sometime. Panther-Lair.com. Thanks so much for tuning in today. Hope you had a good start to the week. Hopefully you didn't really have a case of the Mondays. Hopefully, proverbially speaking, the browser window in the upper corner of your screen is working. Proverbially, figuratively, it's obviously working, but you know what I'm saying. So hope you have a good Tuesday. Enjoy it, and we will catch up with you tomorrow on the Morning Pit right here, youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com.